The room froze. Even the soft music from the string quartet seemed to fade as 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My parents exchanged confused glances. Stockholm meant nothing to them, but I noticed Drive. Peterson from Table 4, a retired physics professor, sit up suddenly, his glass halfway to his lips. He understood exactly what a call from Stockholm implied. They called to inform me, I continued, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out my voice, that I've been awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute silence, the kind of silence that swallows everything. I could hear the ice maker cycle in the kitchen, the faint clink of a spoon dropped somewhere near the bar. 200 guests stared at me like I had just announced I was an alien who'd been living under an assumed identity. Then, at last, Mom spoke, her voice trembling. The Nobel Prize? Yes, I said, still barely believing it myself, for my work on synthetic enzyme catalysis. It sounded surreal to say it out loud. The words felt too large for the moment, too grand for this room full of crystal chandeliers, champagne glasses, and polite society chatter. Dad's champagne flute slipped from his hand and shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound made several guests jump. Sarah, he said slowly, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time, are you saying you won the Nobel Prize? The actual Nobel Prize? Yes, Dad, I said softly, the actual Nobel Prize. For a moment, no one moved. Then Drive. Peterson rose abruptly from his chair, his face glowing with excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice ringing across the hall, do you understand what this means? Dr. Foster has just received the highest honor in scientific achievement. She's won the Nobel Prize. The room erupted. Conversations exploded all at once, gasps, whispers, shouts of disbelief. Phones appeared as guests began Googling my name. I saw a few jaws drop when search results and photos appeared confirming the truth. The quiet, aimless daughter had just become one of the most distinguished scientists in the world. Mom stood there, pale and trembling. But you work in a laboratory, she said weakly, as though that fact alone made it impossible. You don't have a real job. Mom, I said gently, I'm one of the leading researchers in catalytic chemistry. My work has been published in Nature, Science, and Chemical Reviews. It's used in graduate programs all over the world. Graduate programs? Dad repeated faintly, as if trying to translate a foreign language. The work I do isn't a hobby, I continued, finding strength in the truth that had waited years to be spoken. It's research that's changing how we understand chemical processes, work that could revolutionize medicine, energy, and manufacturing. Mrs. Williamson approached timidly, her phone in hand. Sarah, she said, stunned, I just looked you up. There are dozens of articles about your research. The New York Times called you one of the most innovative chemists of your generation. Mom's knees seemed to weaken. The New York Times wrote about you? Several times, I said, most recently, when my carbon capture research was implemented by 3 major energy companies. Dad blinked, trying to process. You work with energy companies? Among others, I replied. Pharmaceutical companies license my research for drug development. Manufacturing firms use my processes to create new materials. My work has applications across dozens of industries. The room buzzed. Every face around us wore the same expression, shock melting into awe. For years, my parents had introduced me as their academic wanderer, their daughter who couldn't quite get her life together. Now they were realizing that the woman they'd underestimated had quietly reshaped the foundations of modern chemistry. Dr. Foster, a voice called from across the room. I turned to see Professor Martinez from the local university, his face alight with astonishment. I had no idea you were the Sarah Foster. Your enzyme research is revolutionary. We've been using your papers in our graduate seminars for years. He shook his head in amazement. Do you realize you're the first Nobel laureate this city has ever produced? The first Nobel laureate? Mom repeated, her voice cracking. Professor Martinez nodded eagerly. Dr. Foster's work will be in textbooks for generations. Her synthetic enzyme research has opened entirely new fields of study. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with a kind of magic. I could see my parents struggling to reconcile this truth with everything they'd believed about me, the daughter they'd worried over. The woman they'd pitied for being unstable and directionless had just joined the ranks of the most accomplished scientists in the world. Marcus appeared beside me, his face pale. "Sarah, is this real? You actually won the Nobel Prize?" "Yes, Marcus, it's real. But you never said anything, you never told us you were doing work like this." "I tried," I said quietly. "Remember when I told you about my paper being published in Nature? You said nobody reads that stuff except professors." Professor Martinez smiled. "Publishing in Nature is like winning an Oscar in science." "An Oscar?" Mom echoed faintly. "And Dr. Foster hasn't just published there," he went on, warming to his topic. "She's published in Science, JACS, Chemical Reviews, every top-tier journal in chemistry. Her citation index is extraordinary." Each new revelation struck my parents like a wave. Their world was tilting, and I could see the disbelief turning to realization. "When I won the Breakthrough Prize last year," I added softly. "I mentioned it at Christmas dinner. You thought it was a nice little award and asked if it came with money." "The Breakthrough Prize?" Professor Martinez said, astonished. "That's a $3 million award." Dad's mouth fell open. $3 million? "Just the prize money," I said gently. "The research grants and licensing fees are separate." Mom swayed slightly. "Licensing fees?" "Companies pay to use my research," I explained. "The pharmaceutical applications alone generate about $2 million annually." You could have heard a pin drop. For 12 years, they had worried about my financial stability, while I had quietly been earning more than their combined investments. Then Drive. Kim, the chief of research at the regional medical center, approached. "Dr. Foster," she said warmly, "your synthetic enzyme work has been essential to our cancer drug program. We've been hoping to consult with you." "Cancer research?" Mom whispered, tears starting to fill her eyes. "Yes, Doctor," Kim said gently. "Her enzymes could revolutionize how we approach targeted drug delivery." The gap between my parents' perception and reality finally shattered. Their daughter's little hobby wasn't just legitimate, it was changing lives. Then Dad picked up the microphone again. "Everyone, please," he said, voice shaking. "I need to make an announcement." The crowd fell silent. "Half an hour ago, I told you our daughter was still finding her way," he said, looking right at me. "I called her work a hobby. I was wrong. Embarrassingly wrong. My daughter has just been awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. She isn't finding her way, she's leading the way." Applause thundered through the hall. I felt my throat tighten as Mom covered her mouth, tears streaming freely now. "Sarah," Dad said softly into the mic, "I'm sorry. We didn't understand what you were doing. We never really listened. We measured your success by our standards, not realizing you were operating in a world we couldn't even comprehend." The apology was more than I ever expected. It bridged years of misunderstanding, years of feeling invisible. Professor Martinez raised his glass. "To Dr. Sarah Foster," he said proudly, "to discovery, perseverance, and the courage to follow your own path." The crowd echoed the toast. Glasses clinked. And in that moment, I finally felt seen, not just as their daughter, but as myself. Later, as the evening wound down, Mom approached me, her eyes red from crying. "Can you teach us?" she asked quietly. "Teach us what you do. I want to understand your world." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. When the lights dimmed and I walked out into the cool night air, the stars above the Lancaster Country Club shimmered like molecules in motion. For years, I had sought recognition only from my peers, but that night, the recognition I'd never expected, the understanding of my own family, meant more than any medal, any applause, any prize. Because the Nobel Prize had confirmed what I'd always known deep down: sometimes the most important work happens far from the spotlight, in quiet rooms, by people who are simply too passionate to stop asking why. The chandeliers glittered like frozen stars above the crowded banquet hall. My parents were seated at the head table, glowing with pride as they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The air was filled with polite laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the faint melody of a string quartet. To everyone there, it was another elegant night at the Lancaster Country Club, another display of social perfection for the Fosters. Then my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a wrong number. The voice on the other end had a Swedish accent and a calmness that seemed oddly deliberate. "Dr. Foster," the caller said, "this is the Nobel Committee in Stockholm." For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I stood there, surrounded by chatter and music, realizing my life had just changed, though no one else in the room knew it yet. My parents exchanged confused glances as I returned to the table. "Everything okay, dear?" Mom asked lightly, unaware that the universe had just shifted under our feet. I drew in a steadying breath. "Actually," I said, my voice trembling, "that was a call from Stockholm." "Stockholm?" Dad frowned. "Who do you know in Sweden?" Across the room, Dr. Peterson, the retired physics professor who'd taught me as a teenager, straightened suddenly. He alone seemed to recognize the weight behind those words. "They called to inform me," I continued, my voice soft but clear, "that I've been awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry." The words seemed to fall into a vacuum. The orchestra stopped mid-note. 200 guests turned toward me as though I'd just spoken in another language. The silence was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the ice maker in the kitchen. "The Nobel Prize?" Mom whispered. Her napkin slipped from her lap. "For my work on synthetic enzyme catalysis," I said, feeling both detached and profoundly alive. "The research I've been conducting for the past 8 years, you know. The little science hobby you mentioned in your speech." Dad's champagne glass slid from his fingers and shattered across the floor, scattering reflections of the chandelier into 1,000 tiny stars. "Sarah," he said slowly, "are you saying you won the Nobel Prize? The actual Nobel Prize?" "Yes, Dad, the actual Nobel Prize." For a heartbeat, no one moved. "Then drive." Peterson rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice trembling with awe, "do you understand what this means? Dr. Foster has just received the highest honor in science. She's won the Nobel Prize." Gasps rippled through the hall. Then the murmurs began, a swell of disbelief, excitement, envy, pride. Phones lit up as people started searching my name online. The same guests who'd spent years whispering that I'd never settled down were now looking at me like I'd materialized from some distant galaxy. Mom blinked rapidly. "But you work in a laboratory," she stammered. "You don't have a real job." "Mom," I said gently, "I'm one of the leading researchers in catalytic chemistry. My work has been published in major journals. Universities around the world use my research in their graduate programs." "Graduate programs?" Dad echoed, like the words were foreign currency. "The work I do isn't a hobby," I continued. "It's changing how we understand chemical reactions. The Nobel Committee just confirmed that." Mrs. Williamson, Mom's best friend, stepped forward with her phone trembling in her hand. "Sarah, I just found you online. There are articles about you everywhere. The New York Times calls you one of the most innovative chemists of your generation." "The New York Times?" Mom asked faintly. "Several times," I said. "They featured me most recently when my carbon capture research was adopted by 3 major energy companies." Dad blinked. "You work with energy companies?" "Among others," I said. "Pharmaceutical firms license my research for drug development. Manufacturing companies use my enzyme models to produce sustainable materials." The scope of it all was landing, not just for my parents, but for everyone watching. For 12 years, they'd thought I was an aimless academic. In reality, I'd been building one of the most recognized scientific careers in the world. "Dr. Foster," a voice cut through the noise. Professor Martinez from the local university was pushing through the crowd. "I had no idea you were the Sarah Foster. Your enzyme papers are required reading in our seminars. The first Nobel laureate our city has ever produced," he added reverently. My parents' faces shifted between disbelief and dawning awe. For the first time, I saw something in their eyes that looked like humility. "Sarah," my brother Marcus appeared beside me. "Is this real? Did you actually win the Nobel Prize?" "Yes, Marcus," I said softly. "It's real." "But you never said you were doing anything this big." I smiled sadly. "I tried, but every time I mentioned my work, you said it sounded too academic to matter." Marcus looked down, ashamed. "I remember." "Nature," Professor Martinez interrupted, "is the world's most prestigious journal. Publishing there is like winning an Oscar for scientists. An Oscar? Mom repeated weakly. And she hasn't just published in Nature, he added. She's in Science, Chemical Reviews, JACS, every top-tier publication. Her citation index is extraordinary. The guests murmured. My parents sat frozen, as though the last decade of misunderstanding was being rewritten in front of them. When I received the Breakthrough Prize last year, I said quietly, I mentioned it at Christmas. You asked if it came with money. Professor Martinez's eyebrows shot up. You won the Breakthrough Prize, too? That's a $3 million award. $3 million? Dad croaked. Just the prize money, I said gently. The research grants and licensing fees are separate. Licensing fees? Mom echoed faintly. Companies pay to use my discoveries, I explained. The pharmaceutical applications alone bring in around $2 million annually. A hush fell again. For years, my family had worried about whether I could afford rent, and here I was, unknowingly funding more research than our city's entire university department. Dr. Foster, another voice called. It was Dr. Kim from the Regional Medical Center. Your enzyme models are crucial to our cancer treatment trials. We've been trying to reach your institute. Mom's head snapped toward her. Cancer treatment? Her synthetic enzymes, Dr. Kim explained, can be used in targeted drug delivery, fewer side effects, higher precision. I watched my parents try to connect the dots. The daughter they'd pitied was helping cure diseases. Dad suddenly stood, taking the microphone again. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice shaking, I need to say something. The room quieted instantly. Half an hour ago, I told you that my daughter was still finding her way, that she had a little hobby. I was wrong. His eyes met mine. She's not finding her way, she's leading the way. She's not playing around in a lab, she's changing the world. A murmur of applause began, growing until the entire room stood and clapped. Cameras flashed. Tears stung my eyes as I realized the moment was not about fame or validation, it was about finally being seen. Later, as the crowd thinned, my parents came to me, their faces soft with wonder. Sarah, Mom said, tears in her eyes, I don't even know where to start. Start by believing me, I said gently. That's enough. Can you teach us? She asked. About your work, your discoveries, I want to understand. I'd love that. As we left the hall, Dad touched my arm. One more thing. Sarah, are you happy with all of this? I smiled. Yes, more than I ever imagined. I'm doing what I was meant to do. He nodded, voice thick. Good, that's all that really matters. The next morning, my name was everywhere, front pages, academic journals, online headlines, local chemist wins Nobel Prize, reporters camped outside my lab, students brought flowers, Dr. Peterson sent a proud email with 3 words, you earned this. But the message that meant the most came from my parents. A simple text from Mom read, reading your papers now, we're proud beyond words. That night, when I walked into my quiet laboratory, the hum of equipment, the faint smell of acetone in the air, I realized something profound. The Nobel Prize was the world's recognition of my work, but my parents' recognition, their understanding, that was something deeper. Because sometimes, the real breakthrough isn't in the lab. It's in finally being seen for who you truly are.